my friends are simps.
Back in April of 2021, I bought an Akai Force and uploaded a video not too long after that, talking about the reasons why I had decided to get one and what I was looking forward to the most about using it. Now, it's been about 2.5 years since that point, and my perspective on the Force has shifted quite dramatically, to the extent that I thought it was worth doing a follow-up video to explain what I think about it now and what's changed in that intervening period. At this stage, I have come to really appreciate the Force with all of its flaws, but not for the reasons that I expected initially necessarily. And to be honest, it has come to fill a completely different role than I thought it was going to when I first bought it, which is something that you'll hear a bit more about if you stick through this whole video. In case you're wondering, I have got zero relationship with Akai. This is not a sponsored video in any way, shape or form. These are my genuine thoughts, for better or worse, as someone who's been using the Force for a wee while. Though, to be clear, I am fully open to bribery, so if Akai want to come a knocking, then you know where to find me. One of the main ways that I had envisaged using the Force was as some kind of all-in-one music production workstation, you know, a hardware alternative to Ableton, if you will, where I could sequence, record, mix, and then ultimately, hopefully, perform tracks without ever having to touch a computer. And unfortunately, that hasn't really been the case. The way that you put songs together within Force is by playing or triggering, I guess, your various clips in real time, recording them into what's called the arranger, so kind of similar to Ableton. In theory, you can then edit the clips as you see fit to move them around and change the length and all that kind of thing, but in practice, this is incredibly fiddly and difficult to do accurately, at least on the touch screen. So much so that I've basically given up on that completely. Instead, what I've been doing is recording basic arrangements that are roughly kind of what I want the song to be like, and then exporting the stems to Logic for any further changes that I need to make, which kind of defeats the original intended purpose of getting this thing, or at least a big part of it anyway. The other reason that having the Force as this kind of all-in-one super device hasn't really worked out is because I found the sequencing options to be rather uninspiring, in the sense that you can't really do anything especially weird with them. So whilst there are great scaled inputs, so you can play piano or keyboard perfectly within key without knowing music theory, which is great, and there is basic step sequencing available, there's no per step effects like you would find in a tracker, for example, which is something that I used heavily in my music. And if you want to make adjustments to individual portions of your sequences, then it can quickly become fiddly again, as you have to contend with the touch screen. Ultimately, because of all of this, everything that I wrote ended up sounding pretty boring, to be honest. Now, I'm willing to accept that this is probably down to my own particular tastes and individual approach to making music. However, whilst on the surface, it seems like the Force is capable of wearing lots of different hats, and Akai, by the way, go to some lengths to show off its versatility in their videos. My experience, at least initially, made me wonder if they just tried to make this thing do a bit too much. Now, at some point, my entire relationship with the Force changed for the better, and that was when I started to treat it more like an MPC. As soon as I started sampling in external sources, instead of using just the built-in synths or sequencers, loading in one-shot samples and all that kind of stuff, the possibilities really came to life. By this, I'm not referring to the auto sampler, by the way, which was a feature that I originally thought I would make loads of use of to capture my various hardware synths and play them back. Instead, I'm talking about syncing up other bits of gear to quickly and easily grab perfect loops and then trim, warp and combine them with others later on. In particular, I've really enjoyed building up huge drum kits or tracks with effects, playing rhythms out and then layering all of that on top of different kinds of samples that I've grabbed, creating loops that weave in and out of one another in a polyrhythmical way, playing about with combinations of those by triggering different clips and seeing what I can come up with. That has been really rewarding and more like the Ableton style hardware experience that I was looking for, crossed with the best bits of an MPC. However, I didn't really get that by treating Force as a DAW style device. I had to deliberately think about it like my MPC 2500, for example. The way that I've found myself using the Force most often has been sampling in old vinyl records and then remixing them by chopping up the samples and spreading them across the 64 pads. Whilst these are much smaller than their MPC counterparts and I can see people that are used to the originals maybe sniffing at them for that reason. They also give you a huge amount of versatility because you can have 64 samples at your fingertips. Creating in this way feels incredibly natural, which shouldn't really be a surprise because this is kind of the area that Akai have built their whole reputation on. Perhaps bizarrely, despite this, the two inputs in the back of the Force don't really lend themselves to sampling from a turntable. They are combination quarter-inch jack/XLR inputs for a start. There's no RCA connections, and each of them have their own dedicated gain knob without a centre indentation. So if you want to sample in stereo, which you probably do if you're, using a turntable, unless you've got some bizarre monophonic record, which, I mean, there's one here. Here's a monophonic record, so they do happen. Then, that's a bit of a strange choice, and it can be difficult to find unity and get your levels right. This kind of thing is almost emblematic of the issues that I've had with the Force, in the sense that it doesn't really feel like Akai knew exactly what they wanted this thing to be. Whilst we're on the topic of hardware, there's a lot to love about the Force in that regard, and I'd be remiss not to mention it at all. For a start, you can expand the storage via internal SSD and also removable SD cards, and this has meant that I basically keep my entire sample library on there, which is awesome. And if I want to transfer things between the computer and my Force, I use the SD card. I never have to connect it up, even though you can. The build in general, as you would expect from Akai, is incredibly solid, and there's a load of different connectivity options, even if they aren't the ones that I would necessarily have chosen. I do feel like the use of mini jack MIDI connections on a device this size is an unforgivable sin, and I will never understand why they didn't provide a way to just angle the screen, like on every other MPC that has ever existed, basically. That one change alone would have made the world of difference and hopefully prevented future chiropractor bills, which are now sadly inevitable. Not least because I'm standing weird so I can film this fucking shot. The final thing that I have to touch upon is the general workflow, because it took me quite a while to gel with the Force, and to my shame there were a good few months where it didn't really get much use or attention because of that. Part of the reason for this was simply because it seemed impenetrable for me at first. Whilst you always have to be prepared for a learning curve when you're using a device like this, and it would be churlish to think otherwise, there was so much about the Force that I found to be counterintuitive, and to be honest, still do to this day. There's loads of crucial settings that are hidden in strange places that require particular button combinations to be memorized, and I was frequently frustrated by how complicated it could be to carry out just basic functions. Akai has got its own terminology and specific way of doing things, and always has, which can be overwhelming in of itself, but also made it really difficult to find answers in the manual. You can't exactly search for something if you don't know what it's called, and even if you do know what it's called, well, just you try searching for MIDI in the Akai Force manual and see what happens. There's a few references in there. I don't even think actually the previous experience with MPCs would help necessarily because, well, it didn't for me anyway, and the reason for that is because there's a lot in the Force that is very different indeed from MPCs even. All of this has kind of been compounded by some really strange UX choices, where at times I was convinced that there must be a way to do a particular thing, only to find out that it wasn't possible, or that there was some kind of weird bug that prevented you from being able to do the thing that you thought you should be able to do. For example, whilst you can record automation data in the arranger, so if you tweak knobs and change parameters, it will record it into your performance that you can then export, which is a nice touch. There was seemingly no way to do that with a Chaos Pad style XY effects function, which really makes no sense at all to me. Surely that should have been really straightforward. Similarly, you can't rearrange the order of effects once you've placed them in a chain, something which I know a lot of people have talked about, and there's just no reason for that to be the case at all. Even though I have now been using the Force for some time and I've figured out what I need to know to do what I want to do, I still have to look things up fairly regularly and encounter a lot of these bizarre challenges from time to time, which can be frustrating and really irritating when you're in the middle of just trying to make something. Anyway, coming on to a conclusion, I feel like I've been on a bit of a rant and I've talked a lot about the negatives of the Force in this video, but I don't want to leave you with the wrong impression, because as I said earlier, I've come to really appreciate the Force, and I love the flexibility it provides for chopping up and making music with samples in particular. Being fair, a lot of the issues that I've come across are software related and could easily be fixed with firmware updates. They may well already have been fixed actually, because they're things that you don't necessarily use all of the time. However, due to the nature of this beast and the size of Akai, I would suggest it's probably likely that there are other weird things in there that you'll come across even if some of this has been addressed. And I'm not even sure they could fix things like the workflow complexity, for example. Either way, there's no doubt that this is a really capable device that you can do a hell of a lot with, and for the price it is pretty unbeatable. If you're thinking about getting a Force, my advice would be to really consider what exactly you want to use it for and temper your expectations around the possibilities. If you don't have a clear use case and are just trying to, figure out how things go and see what you might be able to use it for, then I think you might find yourself to be disillusioned quite quickly, because you need to have quite a lot of motivation to use this thing. It's a bit of gear that you really have to sink a bunch of time and energy into, even if you know exactly what you want to do, or if you think you know exactly what you want to do. If you're somebody that makes fairly minimal electronic music, or any type that is heavily loop-based, then you might have a different experience from me completely. However, my experience has been that Force comes into its own when you embrace its sampling capabilities, even if that isn't exactly what Akai have put a focus on. The nature of a device like this means that everybody will have different perspectives anyway, so if you've got one and you want to tell me that I am completely wrong, then you know what to do. Maybe I'll change my mind entirely in a few months anyway. In the meantime, Akai, let's do a deal. I could go for an MPCX if you wanted to give me one. No?